So anyway, Ambassador Joe Wilson's career in international relations spans 3 decades. He served under 5 presidents: Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., and Clinton. And he is widely recognized for his diplomatic leadership. He is hailed as a true American hero by President George H.W. Bush for his efforts to free more than 100 American hostages in Iraq. He was the last American official to confront Saddam Hussein before the start of the Gulf War. He served as the acting U.S. ambassador in Iraq throughout Operation Desert Shield. He has held numerous senior government positions, including ambassador to 2 African nations, and served as special assistant to the president and senior director of African Affairs at the National Security Council. Under direction from the Bush administration in 2002, Ambassador Wilson was sent to investigate reports that Saddam Hussein was seeking uranium yellowcake from Nigeria for Iraq's nuclear program. After his visit, Wilson reported back to Washington there was no truth to the claims of yellowcake. 18 months later, when it became clear the administration had misled the American people about the yellowcake claim, he became the first to openly challenge the administration on the justification for going to war. 8 days after Wilson stated his conclusions in the New York Times editorial, his wife's identity as a CIA operative was revealed by senior White House and State Department officials as retaliation. The betrayal of Valerie Plame's identity, his wife, resulted in the conviction of Vice President Dick Cheney's chief of staff on 4 counts of perjury. In 2004, his national bestseller, The Politics of Truth, was published, where he recounted his diplomatic career and battle with the Bush administration. It's a fascinating memoir that you all should look at buying. It's a tremendous story. In 2010, the Wilson story was made into a major motion picture starring Sean Penn and Naomi Watts, entitled Fair Game, after Valerie Plame's memoir. It's a tremendous movie. Sean Penn does a great job. The fact that Sean is only about 5'8" and the ambassador's about 6'2", it was amazing that Sean was able to play the part so well. So rent that. It's a great movie. Since retiring from federal service, government service, he's worked in international relations and continued to make a global impact. He's chairman of the board of Symbiont Power Africa, helping to rebuild and modernize developing regions through empowering local communities. He also manages J.C. Wilson International Ventures, a consulting firm specializing in strategic management and international business development. He's also a frequent contributor to national and international news media. I've known the ambassador for 2 to 3 years, and I have always been impressed with his ability to analyze an issue from both sides and to expertly outline his position. I am so pleased that he was honored tonight. We were honored tonight by his being here to talk about the Iran nuclear deal and why he supports it. So please welcome Ambassador Joe Wilson.
Thank you all very much. Rabbi, thank you very much for inviting me. Jeff, thank you very much. It's good to be here, I guess. I had no idea that this was such a contentious issue until I saw my congressman last night, Ben Ray Lujan, who said that he had been in a town hall meeting and that it had gotten very contentious. I assumed that here in a synagogue that it would be a no-brainer because, after all, if you look at the polls, Jewish Americans are much more for this deal than Americans at large, quite possibly because Jewish Americans are generally high information voters and consumers, whereas a lot of others in our society may not be. I'm really dislike the idea that the first line of my obituary will read, went to Iran or to Niger and found that there was no there to the story of yellow cake sales from Niger to Iraq. I think a far better first line is I was the last American diplomat to confront Saddam Hussein in Baghdad in the run-up to the Gulf War of 1991, which my Republican friends and George Herbert Walker Bush, who was president then, I like to refer to as the good Gulf War. During my time in Iraq, I was actually the embassy's liaison to the Jewish community in Baghdad, which at that time numbered about 150 people, who told me every time I went to where they worshipped that they were below the replacement rate. And I suspect that most of them who were still alive are probably out of Iraq now. But it was obviously very moving to be with that community, particularly when one looks at the period before 1948 and how vibrant that community was in Iraq. During the course of my fight with the Bush administration, I was attacked for any number of things, as any of you who may have followed it would recall, including being anti-Semitic, because I had the temerity to suggest that Saddam Hussein had a very narrow world view, that he had only traveled to Cairo in the past, and therefore, when he was assessing his invasion of Kuwait, he made some assumptions which turned out not to be true, but those assumptions were that if he could get that invasion into the UN system, then he would benefit by the UN slowness and the lack of international sort of international agreement as to what should be done. And I quoted Resolution 242 and 338, and I also quoted the fact that the Moroccans have been in Western Sahara for now 35, 40 years, and have not been, as an occupying power, have not been out of there. So I was attacked for that. Fortunately, Forward Magazine came to my defense. They wrote an article, the first paragraph of which said, Joe Wilson is the father of 2 Jewish kids, and his wife is a great-granddaughter of a rabbi. Now, I don't subscribe to Forward Magazine, but a friend of mine, Sid Blumenthal, does, and he called me and said, actually, I think I was already here, I was here for something. And he said to me, congratulations, you're now a member of the tribe. And I said, what do you mean? He said, yes, Forward Magazine has made you a tribe. I will say this, I do know enough to leave the door open on Passover and not to drink Elijah's glass of water. Now, on to the Iran deal. I assume that you have all read a lot of what has been put forward. There is a lot out there that is put forward for political reasons. There's a lot out there that's been put forward for substantive reasons. And sometimes it's difficult to separate the substance from the politics. So I am not a nuclear weapons expert. I don't even play one in the movies. And it was not Naomi Watts who played me in the movie, by the way. So it was Shawnee. There are a lot of nuclear arms specialists in this state who actually were involved in the negotiating process. And if after this time we spent together this evening, you still have some questions, I would suggest that you turn to those people who are involved in the Sandia Labs and up at Los Alamos, because they were intimately involved in the technical side of these discussions. What you have here is not a political agreement alone. You have a political and technical agreement which amounts to what everybody considers to be the most comprehensive and most intrusive arms control agreement that's ever been negotiated up until now. It, in fact, should be the standard going forward as we look at arms control agreements in the future. It reduces the amount of centrifuges, most of which grew up in Iran during the Bush administration, when the only policy was to not to talk to them and to impose as many possible sanctions as we could. It reduces the volume of enriched uranium down to 300 kilos, which is far less than what is required for the construction of one nuclear weapon. And don't take my word for it. Perhaps the best political statement or political analysis of it that I've seen was done by Jerry Nadler in his piece that he wrote when he came out and said that he was going to vote for the agreement, and that was one of the things that he specifically specified. It gives us, the international community, it gives us somewhere between 15 and 25 years where we have very close oversight of what is going on in Iran and all of their nuclear facilities. It holds the Iranians to account for everything that they do, both in terms of what they're doing at some of their reactors and what they're doing in the supply chain, procurement chain, requires them to account for every little bit of uranium that they may or may not be processing. There are two sticking points that have come up a number of times. One is the so-called 24-day time frame, time lapse between the time that you see a violation and the time that you can actually react to it. Those people who are involved in the business will tell you that in 24 days you cannot remove traces of nuclear activity that is there, and the inspectors would be able to see it. The other thing that has come out recently was an article in the AP that said that we should be worried because there is a secret side agreement between the IAEA and Iran. I've taken a look at this. I have not seen the agreement, but all the reporting I've seen from both American sources and international sources is that the side agreement is in fact a very technical agreement. It's designed to ensure the integrity of every sample that is taken from every site, to reassure the Iranians that somebody's not taking samples and then substituting other samples for them, and to ensure the international community that in fact there is somebody there who will be observing the samples as they are taken randomly from random sites, and as they are made, that the process and the chain of custody has integrity. Integrity is necessary to do the sort of studies. Iran has agreed to reduce by 2/3 its installed centrifuges from 19,000 to 6,104. It's agreed not to enrich uranium over 3.67% for at least 15 years. And people who are in this business, and again, I'm not, but I just heard again today from the Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of International Affairs in Washington, the judgment amongst those people who do know think that this is a 25-year project rather than just a 10 or 15-year project. That in fact the secondary and third, tertiary requirements upon the Iranians will make it extraordinarily difficult for them to develop any sort of capacity whatsoever for nuclear arms for the next quarter of the century. By which time those kids who were born in Tehran today will be of the rebellion age. Those who are rebelling in Tehran today will be old and wise and be directing the way that they can rebel. And the world will be a much different place from what it is today. I believe that this is an agreement that it is in the interest of the United States of America. And when I say that, I use the term United States of America in its broadest sense as a leader of the global community, particularly when it comes to nuclear arms and nuclear arms reduction. It is not strictly an American agreement with the regime in Tehran. It is in fact an international agreement which includes the other major nuclear powers in the world, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France. It also includes Germany. It's called the P5+1. So it's all permanent members of the UN Security Council. It holds Iran to an extraordinary high standard, and it gets this nuclear issue off the table for the foreseeable future. It channels it into a place where there will be intrusive oversight and intrusive inspection. At this late stage, I would point out also that it addresses the concerns that were raised by Mr. Netanyahu and have been raised by Mr. Netanyahu over the years. There have been some questions raised recently about what are we going to do. They will get $1.5 billion, $150 billion, which they will use for terrorist-related activities, and we have to deal with all the other issues of this abominable regime at the same time that we're doing the nuclear deal. When we embarked on this project several years ago, it was in fact the Israeli government that made the point of saying that you have to deal with the nuclear issue separate from everything else. This came up again recently as we were beginning to talk to the Iranians about how to deal with the threat of ISIS or Daesh or ISIL, depending on what you want to call it, when the Israelis once again reiterated that all that had to be separate from and distinct from our discussions on the nuclear, the problem of nukes in Iran, or the nuclear developments in Iran. Now, just for some perspective, the United States intelligence services have been saying since the middle of the last decade that while Iran has been working towards developing the technical ability to manufacture nuclear weapons, no decision has been made whether to do so or not. Now, again, you don't have to take my word for it. I would refer you to George Bush's book, Decision Points, where he makes that point very clearly, and where he says it becomes very difficult for him to consider military action against Iran, given the unanimous consensus of the U.S. intelligence communities, the community, that Iran was not, in fact, had not made a decision to go and develop nuclear weapons. So, on the other side, should in fact we fail to sign on to an agreement that the negotiation for which we led, we exercise our responsibilities as a global leader to come to grips with what the Israelis have talked about as an existential threat to Israel, and which we have always understood to be a threat to the region and beyond. Should we fail to sign on to that agreement, our standing as an international leader will be sorely tested. We will find ourselves isolated from the rest of the world. And if we actually think that we will be able to go back to status quo ante and in fact reimpose a multilateral sanctions or an international sanctions regime on Iran, I would point to you to an article that showed up just yesterday about the British foreign minister going to Tehran to reopen the British embassy and taking with him the vice president of business development of Shell Oil Company. So if we don't do this, the losers in this are going to be the United States in a profound way. It will demonstrate to the rest of the world that we no longer have the capacity to exercise that sort of leadership that they have come to expect since the end of the Cold War, and which I think was most remarkably demonstrated when we put together the coalition in 1990, which resulted in the rollback of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. If you recall, there were 12 UN resolutions passed. The United States headed a coalition of over 30 countries, and 90% of that war was paid by the rest of the world. That was an exercise in leadership. If we fail to do this, the rest of the world will make their own accommodations to a new reality. In addition, if we refuse to do this, it plays into the hands of the hardliners in Tehran. It will demonstrate to them that they were right all along. It will undermine the forces of moderation in Tehran and will set back any possibility of constructive dialogue for the foreseeable future. They will feel betrayed. They too stepped up to this deal, and the moderates within the Iranian government had to fend off their own right-wingers. The only people I would suggest that it would benefit would be the Iranian right-wingers, the Republican Party, which is motivated more by a profound distrust bordering on pathological of the Obama administration, and in fact, I think, the state of Israel. People that may benefit Mr. Netanyahu and his political ambitions, but I don't believe, and people that I talk to about this do not believe for a minute that it benefits Israel's long-term strategic interests. Iran would be encouraged, well, first of all, the intrusive mechanisms would not be in place, and the opportunity for Iran to pursue whatever sort of nuclear program it wants to pursue would be far greater. Now, I can tell you from my time in Baghdad, when we were involved in rolling back Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, there was a lot of misunderstanding going into the part of the rest of the world as to what our objectives were. There was great concern in the Arab world that we, in fact, were just going in and we were going to overthrow Saddam Hussein because we didn't like him. And that, of course, did not happen then. That happened somewhat later. But at that time, the Indian general who was in charge of peacekeeping forces along the border between Iran and Iraq came to see me, and he said, during the course of our conversation, he said, "You do understand, don't you, that however noble your intentions are, the signal you're sending to the rest of the world is if you want the United States not to invade you, you better get your nuclear weapon in place sooner rather than later as a deterrent." So I would leave you with that as something to think about as we go forward. This is not to say that that everything will come up roses in the relationship between the rest of the world and Iran, between the United States and Iran, or between Israel and Iran, because it won't. There are obviously still a number of issues out there that are profoundly disturbing to a lot of people. There are human rights issues. There are threats against Israel's sovereignty. There are Iran's meddling in the region, their support for terrorist activities, all of which are legitimate concerns and will still need to be addressed. But the opportunity to address them in the absence of this sort of nuclear overhang does give us an opportunity really to come to grips with them with this one thing off to the side. It provides us with 10 to 15 years in which we can pursue confidence-building measures, so everybody in the region who is suspicious, each of the other, can find ways to dialogue, can find ways to move their disputes and their arguments from paramilitary and quasi-military screams and shouts at each other into channels where progress can be made. And I would add to some statements that have been made lately about the President and the administration having failed in this foreign policy, having alienated our allies, and having given comfort to our enemies. That if you take a look at this in the context of a multilateral agreement that it is, it brought together our allies, it brought together our competitors, and it brought together our adversaries. And that in and of itself helps to build confidence among the various parties. Again, don't take my word for it. Go out and do your own research. There are 51 different Christian clergy members who recently signed on to a letter supporting the deal. because the Christian evangelical community, for its own reasons, and maybe some of the representatives who are here tonight, have problems with it. Their problems, I would suggest to you, have nothing to do with the survival of Israel as a sovereign nation state. There are any number of retired members of the Israeli national security community who have also expressed their support for the deal. Acting members in government at the technical level, bureaucratic level, civil service level, have raised concerns in the past. Those concerns have been addressed, most recently by the Secretary of Energy in his testimony to Congress. I would recommend to you both his statement and his testimony, his opening statement, when he testified before Congress. Look at the State Department fact sheet on this. Look at, I think there may be some people from J Street here tonight. I don't represent J Street. In fact, I should have said this as a disclaimer from the beginning. I represent only myself in this. I was asked to come and share with you my experience, the fact that I've signed on to letters, and the fact that I'm married to somebody who's a member of the Plowshares Board and a leader of the Global Zero movement. And if you saw their YouTube video the other day with Morgan Freeman and Jack Black and a few others, the great part of that is that it went a little bit viral, and everybody who's mentioned it on TV refers to Morgan Freeman, Jack Black, Queen Nora, and Valerie Plame. Nobody refers to Tom Pickering, who probably is the greatest expert on this subject of anybody, anyways, but not nearly as sexy as that. Has never played God. I would also commend to you a piece by Daniel Levy in Foreign Affairs, published by the Council on Foreign Relations. And I think it is entitled Iran Deal Enthusiast. Danny, as some of you may know, was involved in any number of negotiations in the previous Israeli administrations. He's a very thoughtful guy who I happen to know, and I think this is a very thoughtful piece. It goes into the ramifications from an Israeli perspective of the long-term impact of this campaign being waged by Mr. Netanyahu's government and his allies here in the United States against the deal. I won't go into that. It's really something that is probably better approached by people like Daniel. And I'm happy to take any questions and talk to you. Senator Martin Heinrich has spoken to this. A number of members of the American intelligence community have spoken out on this. I will refer all of those to you for your understanding. Let me conclude by saying, once again, this is not, in my judgment, the best of a bad set of options. I think this has the potential of turning into a very good deal that will render far more stable the region, and which will give Israel the benefit of time and space to deal with the problems that Israel faces being a very small Jewish country in a very big Muslim region. So, with that, I'm happy to take any and all questions. And I don't believe I've ever spoken anywhere where the questions have been one sentence. That's not the sort of controversy I court, so have at it. Thank you very much.
Gordon's going to come around with the mic. We'd like to have everybody hear the question. Thank you, Gordon.
You start in the back.
Okay, 2 sentences.
What? One sentence. Yes, sir.
No, he's coming to the back.
Yes, sir. I'm just wondering why the other Arab countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia, seem to be against the accord. I mean,
Well, they are nervous about the accord. the Shia and the Sunni, a conflict. Unfortunately, Mr. Bush, when he invaded Iraq, didn't know that there were Shia and Sunni in Iraq, but there are, and they've only been feuding for about 1,400 years. And what the Saudis are worried about is that this will result in a Western tilt towards Iran and a Western tilt from Iran, which concerns them as it relates to particularly their eastern regions where they have a large Shia population and where, by the way, the oil fields are largely located. It is a problem that the Saudis should have addressed quite a while ago. They certainly have enough money from oil production to ensure that their eastern provinces are not restive. But I would also, the other countries in that region have been supportive, if not as vocally supportive as perhaps Western Europe and the big powers. So this will likely change a lot of the relationships. And if you are the foreign minister, the new foreign minister in Saudi Arabia, you might want to think how you pursue your policies towards your neighbors in the absence of the United States necessarily reacting with a knee-jerk reaction every time you mention the Ayatollahs and the mullahs in Iran.
Next question.
I have a question in regards to the other countries that have signed on to the agreement, Britain, France, Germany. What happens if the Republicans in the Senate are able to stop the United States from signing on? Does that mean the sanctions are lifted by all the other countries? Does that mean Iran continues to develop nuclear weapons? What happens if just the fact that we don't sign on, where do we go forward with this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me just back up a little bit. The way that the vote is scheduled is set up. They would have to actually override the president's veto. They could vote to disapprove, the president would veto that vote, and then he would have to be able to put together a minority of 34 senators to prevent that veto from being overridden, or a similar number in the House to avoid its being overridden in the House. If, in fact, they were able to do that, then everything is up in the air. Not just with respect to the deal with Iran, but also with respect to the sanctions. The United States could maintain its unilateral sanctions. It could attempt to assert some authority by threatening other countries that do business with Iran through the international banking system. There's a real problem with that. That was tried with Libya. The European Community actually passed a law that made it a violation, a crime, to adhere to the U.S. banking problems there. It would effectively, the Europeans and the Asians, the Chinese, are backward. And they're going to be backward, whether we're there or not. And again, it will isolate us, and it will isolate Israel. The rest of the world will do business as usual with Iran. They are not nearly as concerned with the Iranian nuclear threat as is the United States or Israel. The United States gathered them together. If we walked, they wouldn't. And the Iranians would have a number of options. They would be able to open up their business relationships with Europe and Asia. They would not have the intrusive inspection regimes. They would not have to dismantle anything. They can proceed as they see fit, either in terms of their sort of technical work to prepare for the possibility of making a decision, or actually making a decision to develop a nuclear weapons capacity. And we would be left on the outside looking in. And anything that we were to try to do to influence the international community to see it our way in the aftermath of that runs a very real risk of backfiring on us. And again, that's not me saying that. But you can look at recent statements by Treasury Secretary Jack Lew and former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, all of which are out there and available.
That's geographic.
I'm glad I'm not the only one coughing. Oh, not contagious. Are these sympathy coughs? Mike, you listen.
Okay. Ambassador Wilson, you mentioned at the very beginning that you brought information that there was no yellow cake being used, and your information was disregarded, and people were deceived. Here we have 500 members who are going to return to Congress, and we have the perfect 1984 freedmen in Iran. Why should people listen to the truth as you claim you say you are telling us and your colleagues when we have such a great boogeyman? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. Why should you listen to me?
Well,
Basically, the question really is, why should we listen to those who are really pontificating from a political platform rather than from any substance whatsoever? And so what I would suggest to you, again, don't take my word for it, there are any number of technical experts in this area, at Sandia and at Los Alamos, who participated in the negotiations and the discussions. This is an opportunity for the international community to exercise intrusive and comprehensive oversight of everything that Iran is doing. And I could list, I have the State Department fact sheet here on everything that is incorporated in that agreement. I won't understand much of it, and most of the people here won't understand much of it, but it is available for you to take a look at. And it is very, very comprehensive. Not only would the administration have been well advised to listen to me, as the State Department did, and in fact something that people don't often remember, is that at this meeting at the CIA, where it was discussed whether or not I should go to Niger to take a look at this, there were two people at the meeting who said it's not necessary because we have an embassy there and we've been watching uranium production in Niger for 30 years. Everybody else said, oh, we have to do it because the Vice President's asked about it, so we've got to cover our ass. The two people were myself and the Director of Intelligence and Research at the State Department. But in this case, in the case of Iran, if you take a look at the oversight that's being provided, the commitments that Iran has made, not just to the P5+1, but also to the IAEA, in terms of extending out the ability of the IAEA to monitor things like the supply chain and every other aspect of the Iranian sort of nuclear interests. And it will be very, very difficult, according again to people like Secretary Meade and the people at the labs who know a lot more about this than I do. Very, very difficult for them to cheat in a way that goes undetected.
Thank you. I'm one of those people who's coughing, so I hope I can get through this without. You hinted slightly that you are optimistic that over time the internal politics of Iran will change to something that we would regard as more closely aligned with the values that we hold and further from what a lot of us here in America find to be quite irrational. Can you say a little more about what makes you optimistic that things will move in that direction, not only perhaps in Iran, but other parts of that part of the world, if you can comment about that?
Yeah, it's a little bit off topic, but I would just say that nothing remains the same, and that you have an entire generation that has grown up much like Eastern Europe grew up in the 60s and the 70s, longing for some access and some contact with the West and opening. And I think if you just take a look at the pictures of downtown Tehran after the agreement was announced, and in fact, just when President Obama spoke to the Iranian people, I think that's a sign that there is some interest. The hardcore Quds, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, they're getting a little bit old and long in the tooth. Those who were there at the time of the arrival of the Ayatollah and the takeover of the embassy there. And those who were not long in the tooth are now fighting in Iraq, so they may be short in the tooth rather soon. Fights are going on. So I have no particular insight, but there is a certain vibrance that keeps bubbling up to the top. I think it's a wonderful sign that you have the administration that's in place in Tehran now, the president and the foreign minister, both of whom have extensive ties to the West, studied in the West, and speak good English, that bodes reasonably well. My understanding is that the intermarriage between the mullads and the great Persian trading families has been extensive, and generally when that happens, trade works out, wins out. I think in this case, in the case of this deal, which I'm here to discuss tonight, it's very clearly the moderates that won out. And the hardliners have been sidelined. You can expect a resurgence of the hardliners if this deal fails to come to fruition. They will be able to turn to the moderates and say, see, we told you so, you can't trust them. And I would remind everybody that the distrust is mutual. That they distrust us at least as much as we distrust them. And in that part of the world where people remember grudges for 500 years, we're only about 70 years into their basis for distrust. And that's important to understand in a society where I can't even remember who won the Super Bowl 2 years ago. And if any of you can, raise your hand. You know, the most watched event in American culture, I can't remember 2 years ago. Over there, and I remember this very much from Baghdad, they remember the invasion of the Mongol Wars as if it was yesterday. And it was in the 13th century. So that's the downside. If in fact, all of their distrust in the United States that goes back half a century will be essentially revisited.
Do you have any insights into Mr. Netanyahu's political circumstances that seem that are playing out right now?
Again, it's off topic. I'm not a big fan of Mr. Netanyahu. I had the honor and the privilege to lay a wreath at the site of Prime Minister Levine's assassination a year after he was assassinated, and to meet with Mr. Perez at that time. And as you might imagine, my political, I really feel like it is time to find, in fact, I've said this even when I was in Baghdad, the demographics are against a defiant Israel. Israel needs to find a way to make peace with its neighbors, just as its neighbors need to find a way to make peace with Israel. I don't believe that Mr. Netanyahu is doing that. And I will say this, even if Mr. Netanyahu were in fact Jesus Christ, I believe that he is probably so hemmed in by the coalition that has returned him to power, not just this time, but last time as well, that it would be impossible for him to give that Sermon on the Mount. And I think where it becomes poisonous in Israel's relationship with its great friend and ally in the United States is where AIPAC gets involved in this campaign, really to divide all of us. And I will just quote you something that Mr. Rabin said to a friend of mine, Maurice Templesman, at the Plaza Hotel shortly before he was assassinated. He said to him, AIPAC is an arm of Likud. I have to do everything I can to neutralize it. And I think that is as true today as it was then. And I think that it shapes the discussion in ways that is unhealthy. My own view is that if you want to know the vibrancy of the Israeli democracy, don't read the New York Times. Read the Israeli newspapers. And I read Yuri Havnari every time he publishes, every time he comes out with an article. There is not a time that I don't get a little insight from somebody who was there at the beginning and who is still there.
Hi, speaking of AIPAC, I was at the talk a week and a half ago, and the representative said that there will be, after 15 years, there will be instant breakout, and in fact, he sort of painted a word portrait of 2 rooms with padlocks, and he said the minute that this agreement is done, they can unlock the padlocks and virtually within 2 days start a full nuclear program. What do you say about that?
I think that's inconsistent with the analysis done by people who are actually in the business. In fact, it will be 2 or 3 years as soon as this is implemented and as soon as Iran complies with it. And the agreement calls for compliance out to 25 years, basically. Different levels of compliance. But should they find themselves in a position where they can actually revert to a nuclear weapons program, we will know about it. They will have been in violation of it far before the 15 years that we would have reacted. Again, don't take my word for it. Read the Secretary of Energy, who is a nuclear physicist, what he has to say about it. And others who are expert in the think that this deal really gives us about 25 years. Because in addition to the requirement to sort of rebuild their ability to develop fissile material, which in and of itself is a major engineering project. So in addition to the time to do that, then they have to sort of get the fissile material, and then beyond that, they have to develop the devices and to make it go off. So, that's
Mr. Ambassador, right here.
yes.
I find that secret side deal that was signed between Iran and the International Committee, IAEA, correct, to be very disturbing, because I do believe it undermines completely the whole notion of verification.
Yeah.
And it's my understanding that the main pillar of this agreement is verification. Also, It's my understanding that when the AP divulged that side agreement, they labeled it as number 2. I'm wondering, is there another secret side agreement, number 1? Is there another one, number 3? What surprises do you think we may be in store for?
Yeah, I think if you go back and you take a look at the evolution of that AP story, you'll find that there's really very little there. It was a technical agreement between the IAEA and Iran in order to really work out the details of how they collect the swabs of potentially radioactive material from sites at random that ensures the chain of custody, both from the IAEA perspective, in other words, that they get what they want, and from the Iranian perspective, in other words, so that what is given to them to be tested is not later substituted for by somebody who might want to be making some claims about Iranian non-performance of their obligations. Technical side agreements are typical. I don't believe this was secret. And I think if you go back and you take a look at the AP story, you'll find that they've backed down off of that considerably. But that's the agreement as I read it. And as far as other secret side agreements, I think that not being privy to all of whatever may have been discussed or signed off on, I think I can assure you with a considerable degree of confidence that the United States is not signing away its relationship with Israel or its commitment to the defense of the territorial integrity or the sovereignty of our friend and ally Israel. Even though we don't really have we don't have sort of a treaty with Israel defining that relationship, but I think it is safe to say that there is nothing that the United States government would do which would put Israel's security in any risk whatsoever. I can say that with a high degree of confidence. In fact, I can say it with absolute confidence. Just to make sure that there's nothing there that suggests that I'm less than totally certain.
Ambassador Wilson, I'm over here on the far side. And I'm not on the right. My question for you concerns the fact that, number one, Iran is a signatory of the NPT. The nation that has been the most vocal about stopping Iran from developing a nuclear program is not a signatory of the NPT, and in fact has, by all estimations, 200 to 300 nuclear weapons. So even if Iran could develop a nuclear weapon, who or why would they even try to use it against a nation, even though it's very small, has a vastly larger nuclear program?
Again, I think that's a little bit off topic. I think the numbers that I've heard about Israel's nuclear program are substantially less than 300. But certainly they have not only do they have an indigenous force, a national force, that's more than capable of the second strike, but they also have the United States, which is capable of lots of strikes. The rationale in many parts of the third world or of the rest of the world that is interested in a nuclear weapon is along the lines of what I suggested earlier, that the Indian general had told me in the run-up to the Gulf War, that if you want to be sure that the United States is never going to invade you, then you better get your deterrent in place. And so in this case, it's not just the United States, it's also a deterrent from anybody else in the region. Now, one of the other things which I did not mention is that one of the benefits of this is that, and one of the reasons we don't ever talk about Israel's nuclear program, is that idle chit-chat about it and a possible Iranian nuclear capability, if they were to have one, would make all of Iran's other neighbors keenly interested in developing their own deterrent for what they might perceive as being potential aggression as well. As we probably have seen, you have a lot of leverage when you've got a nuke and they don't. We saw that in Japan 7 years ago, as an example. But I would say this, the idea that the Iranians, which has been put out there, is that if the Iranians had a nuclear weapon, they would use it. This is a civilization that dates back some 4,000 years. There is nothing to suggest that they suffer from a suicide complex.
Thank you for coming tonight. My question is on the non-nuclear part of this agreement, the missiles and the regular arms and the threat that could be to the Middle East and Europe. Thank you.
Yeah, I just actually read a piece on this on the way in. The sort of sanctions on the U.S. sanctions that are in place to discourage ballistic missile development and other sort of unacceptable missile development, they will remain in place. So everything else is kind of there. The Russians have already said that they're going to sell some missiles to the Iranians. But again, I go back to the key part of this, which was decided really in consultation and in fact at the strong urging of the Israeli government. And you all know far better than I how strong that urging can be, that the nuclear piece be separate out and distinct from everything else. And so I've served in Iraq, I never served in Iran, and so I'm getting a little bit out of my lane to discuss that in any meaningful way. But I'll say this, that agreements lead to the potential for further agreements. And de-escalation of threats lead to things that are good. Lead to trade, investment, relations, not unlike the sort of relations that existed between Israel and Iran before the return of Ayatollah Khomeini. So, whatever's happened in the last half century is not irreversible. In fact, there are lots of reasons for there to be many, many more sophisticated relationships between and among the various countries that really have no choice but to exist in the region. I'll digress for just a second. I was in Turkey a number of years ago when we were doing Operation Northern Watch. We operated that was the no-fly zones over Iraq. We operated that principally in Turkey. And so we would go down there from our headquarters in Stuttgart, our military headquarters, to talk to the Turks about 4 times a year because they were really nervous about our dropping bombs on a neighboring country. Because as they pointed out, you'll be gone, we'll still be here, and they will remember where those bombs came from. And again, they will remember for a very long time. But at a dinner with the then Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Turkish Armed Forces, Sevik Bir, he got up and he did a tour d'horizon. He went around the neighborhood, all the countries that bordered Turkey, all of which used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. And he pointed out that the best relationship they had at that time was with Iraq, which tells you a lot about their relationship with everybody else in the neighborhood. So after Sevik sat down, I was sitting next to him, and I turned to him, I said, you know, if I were you, the lesson I take away from what you just had to say is your foreign ministry really sucks. That the problem you have is not a problem of bad neighbors, it's a problem of not having figured out how to deal in your neighborhood. Because you can't fly this country out to the middle of the Mediterranean. And I would say the same thing to every other country in the region. That you have to live there. Or here. I don't know how long, Rabbi, how long do you want this to go?
6 minutes if you don't mind.
Pardon me?
You might not have about 6 minutes.
I'll go as long as you want. Castro's got nothing on
Hello, Ambassador. In 1981, Israel spontaneously attacked Iraq's nuclear reactor, and then Saudi Arabia has given clearance for Israel to use its airspace if it makes an airstrike. What if Israel decides to just go on its own and take out the problem? What happens then?
Well, first of all, they have to identify the problem. And so, and I think it takes more probably for this decision than, even though I read this piece, Ehud Barak's piece the other day, what he had to say. It probably realistically takes a little bit more than just Saudis giving permission. Maybe not. But I do recall Larry Eagleberger, who was then the Deputy Secretary of State, flying off to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in the run-up to the Gulf War, and when the Israelis really wanted to get in there and fly some missions over Iraq, and he made it very clear to them that the United States was not going to share the codes with them which would deconflict the airspace, and that if they flew into Iraqi territory, they might find themselves shot down. We don't control the airspace over Tehran or over Iran, but they have, I think, some air defenses. And again, what is the target going to be? You look at, they talk about bunker busters and sites that are deep underground, sites that we now know about. And we have people looking into them, and once this agreement is done, they'll be there every day. Most people, I think, who look at this would say that if you were to bomb the sites, you would save yourself maybe 3 or 4 years before they were able to rebuild, which they would do with a vengeance, and they would be absolutely dedicated to putting in place that deterrent to make sure it didn't happen again. And for that 3 years leeway, you would gain, again, 500 years of enmity. So you can ask yourself, 3 years because you managed to blow up a site, or 25 years because you've managed to do a deal, and the 25-year time frame gives you an opportunity really to pursue other avenues to resolve your differences in a time of great change in the region. The other thought on that from most military experts is that rather than go after the sites, you go after the scientists and the towns in which they're doing their research. Again, you might be successful in that, but I think the downside of that is something that should be very, very carefully considered. It doesn't strike me as being a very good strategic move.
Earlier, you implied that if the United States did not sign the accord, the treaty, that it would be isolated from its negotiating partners, but that Iran would still not have to live up to their end of the agreement. Is that what you meant to
certainly
say?
didn't mean to imply that. I think Iran has many more options should we walk away from this deal. If we sign the deal, their options are very tightly circumscribed because the deal is in fact a good one. It provides for intrusive and comprehensive inspections. none of which would be there in the event that we walked away from it. So I think it leaves Iran with a number of options, and I couldn't tell you which options they might pursue, but they would have, I think, more options, is probably safe to say.
Thank you, Ambassador Wilson, for a very interesting, fact-supported presentation. You made some references at various points in your remarks to the history and, of course, the tendency to remember over long periods of time. I think in the United States we don't remember very much because the United States was responsible for the overthrow of a democratically elected government in Iran, the Mossadegh regime, which led to the installation of a puppet Shah, and ultimately we have what we have today. One of the problems, and I'd like you to comment on this, is that the negative feeling in the United States towards Iran, the distrust, seems to belie what actually happened with the United States engineered overthrow of the democratically elected government.
Well, I think I sort of tried to answer that by pointing out that the distress goes two ways, and the distress of the United States is equally or more deeply profound on the part of the Iranians than our distress of them, which dates back essentially to 1979 and the taking of the hostages. As President Carter said, if you'd only send in one more helicopter, you'd be elected. But I was in the State Department when that happened, and it was obviously riveting for us. I know the charge Bruce Langdon, and of course we had our own experience with hostages being taken in Baghdad when I was there, and our embassy in Kuwait being surrounded by the Iraqis. So I'm very sensitive to that sort of animus or distress. And the argument that I made in the run-up to the Iraq War was that however much you might not like Saddam Hussein, and there were very few people in the country who had greater personal reason not to like him than me, that in and of itself was not a reason not to do, not to consider the national security implications and historic implications of the actions that you were considering. And I would say the same thing in this matter. However great the distress might be on both sides, and it is, there's no doubt about it, this is an opportunity to take one very, very complicated, very dangerous issue off the table. And it came about largely as a consequence of the expressed desires and needs of Mr. Netanyahu and the Israeli government, which is perhaps most graphically expressed when he was at the United Nations with his bomb and the 90% bomb. However silly that might have been, it is a reference point for the mobilization of the international community, led by the United States, to come to grips with what was considered an existential threat to Israel, and certainly a threat to the region, not least of which would have been, I think, a regional arms race. So I think it's in our national security interests, and again, writ large, as a leader of the international community, I think it's in Israel's interest because it responds very directly to the treaties. And I think it's in the region's interest for us all to swallow hard at that mutual distress, try and sideline the hard leaders on all sides, and see if we can't form that coalition from the middle. Isolate the right, the radicals on all sides, and see if men of some historic perspective can find an agreement that gets a region that is more stable and actually contributes to global growth, peace, addressing some of these problems that you now see running Ben Ray Lujan, because we have a shared interest in this. And when I was there, they said, gee, why don't you, the representative said, why don't you come and talk to the synagogue here in Santa Fe? And I said, much as I said to Jeff, yeah, sure, without really thinking, sure, why not? And the rabbi there sent a note saying, this is a very contentious issue, and while we know that you probably have a lot to contribute, emotions run really high, and I wrote him back and said, I think I'll take a pass, because the last thing I want to be is the goyim in between two Jews. I said, I don't want to be the goyim in the middle of an inter-community discussion on this. So I appreciate the respect you showed and really the thoughtfulness of your questions and what I think is a no-brainer, but which has obviously been something that has tied the community in knots. I believe unnecessarily so. And I just think the upside is so much greater than the downside. And some of you I know already have your views, and I'll never be able to change them one way or the other. But I certainly appreciate the opportunity I've had tonight to share my views again, individually, not representing the administration. And I would just, one last point is that there are a lot of people out there who like to refer to me as kind of a Democratic hack without ever remembering that it was George Herbert Walker Bush who appointed me an ambassador in his administration. So I'm a bipartisan hack.
Fact-based presentation, I think, as somebody said, and I think that's what we were looking for, and I really want to thank you. I also want to thank you for your years of service. As I have been suckered into, no, it's not quite true, as I have been invited to talk about, I'm blanking it, the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, the 70th anniversary of which is Thursday, which requires the United States to apply diplomacy before even considering war. That's the role you've played, and so many of your colleagues as well, and that's kept us safer, and so thank you for that. And we're going to let you go right now because there are refreshments out in the rotunda. And if you're not out there before 7:30, there will be a horde of 7th through 10th graders coming through.